The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby above Seattle General's ICU as Margaret Walsh moved through the overnight shift like a ghost moving through a familiar haunting. 53 years old, night shift rotation for 18 straight years, hands that knew every angle of every bed in Raleigh's trauma center. She was changing a dialysis dressing on bed 7 when she overheard the charge nurse at the desk, Navy captain. 5 gunshot wounds. Bagram. ETA for minutes. Her hands kept moving. Sterile technique. Antiseptic smell like copper pennies and cleaning solutions. The old muscle memory activated without permission, her back straightened, her breathing slowed, her focus compressed into a tunnel that saw only the wound in front of her and the steps required to close it. She finished the dressing in 42 seconds and stepped back, rolling her shoulders once, the kind of roll that looked like fatigue but was actually the settling of something deeper into place. The trauma alert came through the overhead speaker like a siren cutting through water. Trauma team to Bay 1. Now. Bay 1 was where they brought the soldiers home. Margaret moved toward the preparation area with the others, her movements economical, no wasted motion. The other nurses, younger, newer, energized by the adrenaline of emergency, they moved like people learning choreography. Margaret moved like a person remembering it. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The kind of quiet that fills rooms because there is weight behind it. Dr. Richard Ashford arrived before the patient did, his presence arriving in the doorway like expensive cologne announcing itself, designer scrubs, the kind that cost more than Margaret's monthly car payment, a watch on his wrist that caught the light like it had been polished that morning. He was 6 feet tall in a way that made him seem taller, the kind of man who'd learned early that volume and certainty could replace actual knowledge. Behind him came the surgical nurses, the respiratory tech, the 2 trauma surgeons already prepping instruments with the precision of people who'd done this 100 times. Margaret stood at the edge of the bay, where the wall met the window. The place where you could see everything without being in the way. She'd learned that position a very long time ago, in a place where standing in the way meant someone died. The smell of the room changed, instruments being laid out, the sharp ozone tang of fresh sterile packs being opened, antiseptic solution spreading across steel like a promise. The ambulance bay doors opened and the stretcher came through like something launched from a cannon. The paramedics were running their report in the clipped, professional tone of people who'd learned to speak in sentences that fit inside moving vehicles. Male, 38, penetrating torso trauma, 5 GSWs from small arms fire, arrived Bagram at 0400 hours local, en route 32 minutes, 2 liters normal saline wide open, 02 sat 89 and climbing, we're losing him, we need surgery now. Captain Derek Moss came through those doors like a ghost with a pulse. He was pale the way people get when they've already lost too much blood, his chest wrapped in field dressings that were already showing through, his right shoulder at an angle that meant the joint was compromised, his left leg immobilized with the kind of splint you use when you don't have time for anything else. But the thing that stopped Margaret's heart, the thing that made her entire body go electric with recognition, was the single dog tag hanging around his neck on a broken chain. Even from 10 feet away, even in the chaos of the trauma team converging, she knew what that tag said. James. Her son's name. Stamped in steel. Hanging around the neck of the man who'd led him through 3 deployments and brought him home twice. Her hands moved toward the chart without permission. Instinct. The need to touch something, to verify, to confirm that the name she saw was real and not a symptom of 18 years of overnight shifts destroying her mind. She reached for the trauma sheet as they transferred him to the bed, her finger steady as a surgical laser despite the way her chest felt like it was collapsing inward. Dr. Ashford was already moving, his voice cutting through the bay like a command, 2 large bore 4s, typo negative, notify surgery, we need the OR prepped for immediate exploration, this man is bleeding out. I need a full trauma workup, CT if he's stable enough, get me a chest x-ray before we move him. Margaret had the chart in her hands. She was reading his name. Derek Moss. Captain. Navy SEAL designation. Bagram casualty. The dog tag around his neck, she could see it clearly now, could see the way the chain had broken on one side, the way the metal had bent as if something violent and sudden had torn it. She knew that tag because James had worn the matching one. She knew it because James had written home about Captain Moss in every letter. Sir brought us home again. Sir says we're the best platoon he's ever led. Sir stood watch while we slept. Walsh. Dr. Ashford's voice, sharp as a blade. Step back. I need someone with current trauma certifications, not whoever they pulled from the night shift rotation. She stepped back. One measured breath. The kind of breath that centers you, that reminds your nervous system that you are still alive and still in control. She set the chart down on the desk with the kind of deliberate care you use when you're trying very hard not to crush it in your fists. Around her, the other nurses were moving with the coordinated panic of people who understood they were in the presence of something serious. The monitors were beeping their urgent songs. The ventilator was hissing air into Captain Moss's lungs because his own breathing wasn't sufficient. The four-pump was running wide open, fluids pushing into his veins to replace what he was losing, what he had already lost. Dr. Ashford was good. Margaret could see that immediately. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd trained at institutions that cost money to attend. His hands were steady. His orders were clear. He knew what he was doing in the way that people who've studied trauma know what they're doing. But he was looking at Captain Moss the way he'd looked at Margaret when he dismissed her, as equipment. As a problem to solve. As something on his path that needed to be moved. Pupil response? Ashford barked. Fixed and dilated on the right, one of the nurses answered. Spinal cord injury. Get me a neuroconsult. Page trauma surgery, we're going to need them. How's the output? Urine's dark. Probably hemoglobin in the urine. The room moved like a tide. People flowing around the stretcher, instruments clicking into place, the mechanical sounds of emergency medicine becoming a symphony that Margaret had learned to hear decades ago in a place where the smell of blood mixed with dust and the sound of helicopter rotors came in the distance like the only promise of rescue left in the world. Margaret moved to the supply station and began pulling everything they would need when, not if, when, something went wrong. 14-gauge needles. Thoracotomy trays. Blood products lined up in order. The kind of preparation you do without thinking about it, the kind that came from muscle memory older than her marriage, older than James, older than the last time she'd let herself believe she could be someone other than just a nurse in a small hospital in Raleigh. That was when she saw Dr. Ashford watching her. He was standing on the opposite side of the trauma bay, his hands gripped in front of him, and his eyes were following her movements with the intensity of a man who'd noticed something he didn't understand. She was pulling trauma supplies. She was prioritizing them in a specific order. She was preparing for complications that hadn't happened yet because she understood, without being told, without consulting a protocol, without hesitation, exactly what was going to go wrong. She felt his gaze like a spotlight. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just a slight tightening at the corners, the way a man's face changes when he's filed something into a mental category labeled "Pay attention to this." Then one of the nurses called out that Captain Moss's pressure was dropping and Ashford turned back to his patient and Margaret turned back to her supplies and the moment dissolved like it had never happened. But something had shifted in the room. The charge had changed. The electricity was different now. Margaret pulled one more tray, the kind you don't usually need until it's already too late to prepare. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was level. She was thinking about James. She was thinking about the dog tag hanging around Captain Moss's neck like a promise he'd kept. She was thinking about the letters James had written and the way he described his commanding officer, someone who could read the terrain like other people read books, someone who made impossible decisions and lived with them, someone who brought his men home. She set the tray down and turned back to the monitors. Captain Moss's heart was still beating. The machines were still recording his vital signs. The monitors still showed him alive. For now. 14 hours into her shift, Dr. Ashford corners her outside Captain Moss's room. His voice carries the clinical precision of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow, loud enough for the entire ICU pod to hear. Margaret, I reviewed the medication logs you accessed at 0247 this morning, logs you have no authorization to review. I'm moving you to nights in orthopedics starting tomorrow for your own good, and I've already called administration about that county transfer they've been offering you. The hallway goes quiet. Two nurses pause mid-stride. A resident stops charting. Margaret doesn't flinch. One measured breath. Her hands remain steady on the patient chart she's holding, the paper white against her skin, and she meets his eyes for exactly 3 seconds before looking back down. "Understood, doctor." She says nothing else. The words are the smallest possible acknowledgement, the kind a person gives when they have learned long ago that speaking up costs more than silence. Ashford's jaw tightens. He expected something more, a defense, an explanation, something to work with, but her composure is a door locked from the inside. He turns and walks away. The nurses go back to their stations. The moment passes like a stone sinking into dark water. The second humiliation arrives at 0600 in the break room when Margaret pours her coffee, black, no sugar, hand steady as she sits down at the table where 3 morning shift nurses and 2 residents are eating breakfast. She sets her cup down. One of the nurses, Sarah, who has worked nights with her for 6 years, stands up without a word. Then the others follow, a choreographed exodus, and they move to the far corner near the vending machines, their conversation dropping to whispers. Margaret stares into her coffee. The steam rises like smoke from a field she doesn't want to remember. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't look at them. She simply sits alone in a room full of people, the message clearer than any written warning. The association with her is contamination. When she returns to the unit, the public board outside the nursing station has changed. In red marker, Dr. Ashford has written her up under the heading Protocol Violations, M. Walsh, Unauthorized Chart Access, Patient 4187, Disciplinary Review Pending. The words are bold enough to be seen from every nursing station in the pod, visible to families passing in the hallway, impossible to miss. It's the 3rd time he's done this in 12 hours, the reassignment announcement, the public humiliation, now the official warning branded in red across the board where everyone works. Each move is calculated, precise, the weaponization of protocol by a man who understands that bureaucracy is a blade that feels like justice. Captain Moss's sister arrives at 11:30, tall in a charcoal business suit, her name tag reading Victoria Moss, Senior Counsel, Arlington. She asks about her brother's bandaging, whether the dressings are being changed on schedule, the concern of someone used to asking questions that get answered. Dr. Ashford smiles, the smile of a man who has been waiting for an audience, and says, "I'll handle the dressing change personally, Ms. Moss, just to ensure you see the standard of care your brother is receiving." Margaret assists, her hands moving through the familiar motions, antiseptic, gauze, tape, while Ashford unwraps the previous dressing and pauses deliberately, looking at the bandaging she had applied that morning. 3 rooms hear what comes next. 2 families turn to listen. 4 staff members stop moving. "Ms. Moss, I apologize for the substandard technique you witnessed earlier. Nurse Walsh here has been with us a long time. Sometimes muscle memory from outdated training takes over. We're working on bringing everyone up to current standards." His voice carries the sympathy of a man expressing genuine concern about a friend's decline. The tone makes it worse than mockery. It makes her sound broken. Incompetent. Past her usefulness. Margaret looks up. 1 tear escapes, fast, the kind of tear that is not crying but physics, pressure finding a path. She takes a single measured breath, and her eyes find his with the kind of clarity that comes from having stared down things that actually kill you. When she speaks, her voice drops a register. It doesn't rise. It descends, cold and steady and precise. "I have changed dressings under mortar fire, doctor. I think I can manage this one." The room goes still. Victoria Moss's expression shifts. Ashford's face hardens, a flicker of something, recognition, uncertainty, fear, crossing his features before he buries it. Margaret wipes her face without breaking eye contact, her movements deliberate, her composure a wall he cannot climb. She doesn't tell him that the dog tag around Captain Moss's neck belongs to her son. She doesn't tell him that James wrote about his captain in every letter home, 3 deployments worth of letters describing a man who saved his life, who made the impossible decisions, who led from the front. She doesn't tell him that burying her husband Tom took everything she had left, that the grief cracked her open and she poured herself into work because work was the only place she could function. She won't lose this man too. She won't let protocol and pride and petty bureaucracy cost her a second person she's sworn to protect. The words stay locked inside, a weight she carries alone. Ashford's smile returns, but it's different now, tighter, a rictus of control slipping. That's the spirit, Maggie. Why don't you take your break early? The nickname lands like a slap, the casual diminishment of a woman he thought was small enough to crush. Margaret turns back to the dressing. Her hands continue their work, perfect, precise, every movement the muscle memory of a woman who has done this in field hospitals and combat zones, and everywhere the word standard means something built in blood, not bureaucracy. The shift continues. Margaret works through lunch. She checks Captain Moss's vitals every 20 minutes despite the reassignment order already in effect, her presence invisible the way 30 years of nursing has taught her to move through rooms. Fluid intake. Urine output. The subtle changes in breathing that mean something is shifting. She's nursing now, not fighting, the way a major operates when the mission requires it, no drama, no announcements, just the work. At 1,400, she assists with his physical therapy, supporting his weight as he stands, her shoulder under his arm. His sister watches, and something in Victoria's expression has changed since the break room moment. She's watching Margaret differently now, the way someone looks at a person after they've seen something that doesn't match the story they were told. He keeps asking for you, Victoria says quietly when Margaret is checking his for. Every time I leave the room, he asks where you are. He doesn't ask for Dr. Ashford. He asks for you. Margaret doesn't respond. She adjusts the drip, checks the flow rate, documents the time in Captain Moss's chart with a nurse's precision. But her hands steady in a way that suggests someone who has held this kind of trust before and knows its weight. The evening shift begins at 1900. Margaret prepares to leave, knowing this is her last scheduled ICU shift before the reassignment to orthopedics takes effect at midnight. Dr. Ashford is still on the unit, reviewing labs, his presence a pressure that makes the air feel different. She stops at Captain Moss's bedside one final time, checking his status, running through vitals with the care of someone saying goodbye to a post she won't occupy again. The monitors show him stable. Heart rate regular. O2 saturation 96%. Blood pressure holding. She stands there for a moment longer than necessary, her hand near the bed rail, and James's dog tag seems to pull weight from her chest. "You're a good nurse," Captain Moss says. His voice is thin from pain, but his eyes are focused on her. "I can see why James talked about you." The words stop her. She looks at him, something in her expression shifting for just a moment, vulnerability, fear, the weight of carrying 2 lives in her hands when she's only supposed to carry 1. Then the wall comes back up. She nods once, a formal acknowledgement, and doesn't speak. Some things are too dangerous to say aloud. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0300, lying in the quiet of the night shift, Margaret is asleep in her car in the parking lot when her phone buzzes. A text from the ICU. Code blue. Trauma Bay 4. She's moving before consciousness fully arrives, muscle memory pulling her upright, her keys already in her hand. The night is rain-soaked and dark, the kind of dark that makes time feel untrustworthy. She runs across the lot, her shoes splashing through puddles that reflect the hospital lights like broken mirrors. The moment she enters the ICU, she knows something is catastrophically wrong. Captain Moss's monitor is screaming. Not the steady rhythm of a functioning heart, but the chaotic alarm of a system in collapse. His pressure has dropped to 68/32. Heart rate climbing toward 160. The numbers are the voice of a body shutting down. Dr. Ashford stands at the bedside with 2 residents, a skeleton crew because it's 0300 on a Wednesday and staffing is what bureaucrats allocate, not what patients need. Margaret moves to the foot of the bed. She can see it immediately, the subtle distension of his neck veins, the way his chest isn't moving air despite the ventilator, the pattern that means one thing and one thing only. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid building around his heart like an assassin in slow motion. Pericardiocentesis, Ashford orders, his voice tight. He's reaching for a needle, a 14-gauge angiocath, prepping the space below the xiphoid process where a needle can enter the pericardial sac. But his hands are shaking. Just slightly. Enough that Margaret sees it. The angle is wrong. Too steep. The needle will miss the fluid and puncture the right ventricle instead. The monitor drops, 65/28. The heart rate climbs to 168. "Doctor, we need a thoracotomy," Margaret says. Not a suggestion. A statement of surgical fact. The kind of assessment that comes from having done it before, from having stood in a field hospital in Kandahar with a man bleeding out and a scalpel in her hand and no time for hesitation. "We need you to assist and let me work," Ashford snaps back, and she watches him guide the needle into the chest wall. It goes in wrong. She can see it in the depth, the angle, the way it doesn't move with the confidence of a man who has done this 100 times. The captain's pressure continues to fall. 62/26. The monitor begins to slow as his heart recognizes it can't generate output anymore. Bradycardia setting in. The beginning of the end. Margaret reaches past Ashford to the surgical cart and takes a scalpel. "What the hell are you doing?" Ashford shouts, but she's already moving, muscle memory taking the wheel, her hands making the incision between the 4th and 5th ribs with movements that belong to a woman who learned surgery not in an operating room but in the dirt of a forward operating base where the alternative to speed is burying the patient. The incision is clean. Fast. Spreading the intercostal muscles, exposing the pericardium, and then, the hiss of air escaping as she opens the sac and fluid rushes out, dark red, the pressure relief immediate and violent. The captain's pressure climbs. 70/40. 85/52. 98/65. The heart rate drops from the tachycardic scream to something that sounds like survival. But the next bay's monitor begins to alarm. The county transfer patient, admitted 2 hours ago, unstable, the kind of case that should never have been assigned to the skeleton crew. Staff rushes toward the commotion. Ashford is still shouting about protocol violations, about Margaret's unauthorized procedure, but she's not listening because the captain's pressure is climbing and that's all that matters, and she's holding the cavity open with one hand, monitoring the chest tube with the other, waiting for the moment when his vitals stabilize enough that someone else can take over. Then the hallway erupts in shouting. A man's voice, raw with grief and rage, screaming about the doctor who killed his brother with the wrong meds. Margaret hears it, registers it as a threat indicator that doesn't belong in the careful choreography of the ICU, but she doesn't turn around because you don't turn around mid-thoracotomy because the patient comes first and the world comes second. The captain's pressure is still climbing. 108/68. Normal. Stable. Alive. The door to the trauma bay kicks open. The trauma bay doors burst open and Margaret is already moving, her hand steady as she pushes the crash cart toward Captain Moss's bed, the monitors screaming their warning song, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation falling, the unmistakable rhythm of a heart losing its argument with physics. The surgical team around her moves like they're underwater, sluggish, uncertain, Dr. Ashford nowhere to be found because it's 0300 on a skeleton crew night and everyone who could help is already committed to other patients 3 floors above. The resident staring at Moss's chest looks 23 years old and terrified. Margaret doesn't ask permission. She reaches for the surgical cart, grabs a scalpel, and her hands move on their own, muscle memory from Kandahar, from a field hospital in Joland district where the power was out and the only light came from a field lantern hung from a ceiling that was more holes than ceiling. Incision. Quick. Precise. Left anterior lateral thoracotomy through the 4th intercostal space, the blade cutting through skin like she's done this 1,000 times, which she has, just not in front of these people, not with a hospital badge and a name tag instead of a call sign. The blood comes dark and fast, she opens the pericardium and there it is, the tamponade, the pressure around his heart suffocating him. She relieves it with movements that feel like coming home and also like betraying everything she promised herself she would never do again. Pressure's rising, the resident whispers, his voice shaking. 85, 90, 95. Margaret doesn't respond. She's already through the worst part, already holding Captain Moss's heart stable in her mind the way she holds all the broken things, the way she's held them since before this kid was born, since before her son James even existed. The monitor shows sinus rhythm. Real rhythm. The kind that means she bought him time. The kind that means he might actually make it. But that wasn't the worst part. The next bay over, the one where they moved the county transfer an hour ago, someone is coding. Margaret hears the crash team working, hears the charge call on the defibrillator, hears the dull thud of compressions on ribs that are probably already broken. She doesn't turn around. She keeps her hand steady on Captain Moss, keeps the pressure even, because that's what training teaches you. Focus on the patient you can save, let the others become someone else's responsibility. Then there's a sound that changes everything. The trauma bay doors don't open. They explode. A man kicks through them like they insulted his family, wild-eyed, 30-something, dressed in clothes that haven't seen a wash in days, and his hands are shaking around a handgun that's pointed at nobody specific but everybody present. Where is he? His voice cracks like he's been screaming for hours. Where's the doctor? The one that killed my brother? The one that gave him the wrong meds? Security is 3 minutes away. Margaret knows this because she's heard that response time before, knows it like she knows her own heartbeat. 3 minutes is an eternity when someone's armed. 3 minutes is enough time to empty a clip into a trauma bay full of medical staff and one unconscious Navy captain with his chest still open. Dr. Ashford presses himself against the wall near the door, his eyes locked on the shooter, his hands raised in a gesture that might be surrender or might be calculation. Margaret watches him try to make himself smaller, tries to determine if he'll speak, if he'll do the thing that might diffuse this, acknowledge the man's grief, say something human, anything that might reach whatever's left of the person inside the rage. But his mouth stays closed. His eyes stay calculating. He's a spectator now, and he's already drafting the report in his mind. She can see it happening, the way he'll phrase her incompetence into the official narrative. The shooter's arm swings toward Captain Moss's bay. Toward the unconscious man on the table. Margaret moves like she's answered the call for the 1000th time, like her body knows something her mind hasn't caught up to yet. She throws herself across the captain's body as the first 2 shots crack through the trauma bay like lightning splitting wood, and the impact hits her right shoulder with a force that feels like a car collision compressed into a single point. The 3rd bullet follows before she can process the first, tunneling into her left side, below the ribs, the kind of trajectory that suggests it's looking for something vital and might just find it. Pain is data. Pain is information. Pain is the nervous system screaming that something fundamental has changed in the architecture of her body. She doesn't scream. She keeps her left hand on Captain Moss's exposed heart, keeps the pressure steady, keeps his blood and her blood mingling on the sheets because that's what soldiers do. They finish the mission even when the mission is now happening inside their own body. The shooter is shouting something, a name, a curse, a prayer, and then there's the sound of security boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The thunder of people trained for this flooding through the door and bringing order back to the chaos with the precision of people who know that every second matters. A female officer brings the man down with 2 clean takedowns and he's on the ground, weapon secured, and Margaret is still conscious, still holding pressure, still listening for the monitor to tell her that Captain Moss is still fighting, is still alive, is still clear, the resident says, and his voice sounds younger now, shocked. Clear. He's stabilizing. Pressure holding. BP 105/68. O2 sat at 96%. Margaret nods. She doesn't speak. The pain in her shoulder is starting to sing now, a high-frequency noise that suggests nerve damage or arterial bleed or both, and her left side feels like someone packed it with broken glass and then set the glass on fire. A resident pulls her back from the table and she releases Captain Moss reluctantly, her hand slipping away from his open chest cavity, and that's when the exhaustion hits her like a wave, That's when her knees forget how to hold her weight. That's when everything goes dark at the edges and then darker still. Someone is screaming for a gurney. Someone else is yelling about active bleeding. Dr. Ashford's voice cuts through it all, clinical and cold as a scalpel. Get her out of here. Lock this room down. Nobody talks to anyone until I clear the incident report. He doesn't look at her. He doesn't thank her. He doesn't acknowledge that she just saved Captain Derek Moss's life for the second time in 12 hours. He just makes a note on his clipboard and turns away. Margaret wakes 3 hours later in post-op recovery, her right shoulder immobilized in a sling that feels like a prison made of athletic tape and purpose, her left side bandaged so tightly that breathing feels like negotiating with her own ribs. There are fours in her wrist, she can feel them without looking, can feel the cold drip of something medicinal and numbing working through her veins. Through the medication haze, through the gauze of morphine and regional anesthesia, she hears voices in the hallway. Dr. Ashford's voice, speaking to someone in an administrative capacity, someone who has the authority to sign termination papers. She violated every protocol we have, he's saying, his tone the same one he'd used to discuss a patient's lunch order. An unauthorized surgical procedure performed without proper consent. She interfered in a family matter, provoked an already unstable individual by inserting herself into his brother's care. And her actions directly led to the shooting. She's a liability. I want her termination papers ready when she wakes up. Margaret closes her eyes and listens to the fluorescent lights hum their electric song above her head. She thinks about Captain Moss alive on a table 3 floors below, his heartbeat holding steady, his rhythm finally his own. She thinks about her son James, somewhere on the other side of the world, still serving under a man whose life she just saved twice. She thinks about the promise she made to her husband Tom 15 years ago, lying in a hospital bed not unlike this one, bleeding out after an operation that went wrong, that she would walk away, that she would disappear into the anonymous world of civilian medicine, that she would be nobody. She failed that promise. And tomorrow, they're going to make her pay for it. Dr. Ashford's voice was calm when he spoke to the hospital board, calm in a way that made Margaret's hands go cold even through the morphine fog. She heard about it secondhand. A nurse named Patricia had whispered it during the morning vitals check, her voice dropping to barely audible. He told them you accessed his medication logs without authorization. That you provoked the shooter somehow. That you created an unsafe condition. Margaret didn't respond. She lay still, her left shoulder immobilized in a sling, her right side wrapped so tightly she could only breathe in shallow increments. The chest tube they'd placed during surgery was gone, but the incision site felt like it was on fire, not pain exactly, more like her body was sending increasingly angry telegrams that she kept filing away for later consideration. Later, when she could afford to feel things. The fours were still running, one in her wrist pulling taut whenever she shifted, the saline drip hissing with each mechanical pulse. 3 days. That's how long Ashford took to dismantle her. He didn't yell. That would have been easier. Instead, he called the Washington State Board of Nursing on Tuesday morning at 9:51 a.m. She knew the time because Patricia mentioned it, worried, and spoke in the tone of a man genuinely concerned about a colleague's competence. Margaret performed an emergency procedure for which she had no authorization, he told them, his voice carrying the weight of a man protecting the hospital system. She accessed my medication logs without clearance. There are questions about her judgment in a crisis situation. Each sentence was a knife, carefully placed, leaving no visible wound. I'm recommending a full license review and mandatory psychiatric evaluation before she returns to any clinical setting. By Wednesday, the board had opened a formal investigation. By Thursday, Seattle General's legal team sent her the termination papers. They brought them to her room in the afternoon, when the pain medication was wearing off and her mind was sharp enough to understand what she was signing away. Dr. Ashford came with them, a gesture that surprised her until she realized it wasn't a gesture at all, it was a final demonstration of his control. He stood at the foot of her hospital bed, a manila folder in his hands, and smiled at her the way a surgeon smiles before making an incision. "Margaret," he said, "I know you thought you were helping." She didn't look at him. She was looking at the monitors beside her bed, at the steady blip of her own heart on the screen, at the numbers that told her she was still alive when she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to be. The board is concerned, understandably, Ashford continued. Your judgment was compromised. You created an unsafe situation by performing a procedure without proper authorization. And now you're a liability not just to the hospital, but to yourself. He stepped closer. His shoes made a soft clicking sound on the tile. But if you sign these papers, I can help smooth things over with the state board. A formality, really? You could still do private duty work, maybe hospice. It won't be ICU, but it will be something. Margaret reached for the pen with her left hand. The right one was useless, 3 stitches in her shoulder, a bullet that had gone clean through, and nerves that weren't firing right yet. Her signature was shaky, a child's hand when she needed an adult's. She couldn't make it steady, so she didn't try. One tear slid down her face, and she wiped it away without breaking her gaze from the heart monitor. 58 beats per minute. Steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Captain Moss is alive, she said quietly. Ashford's smile widened. Because I stabilized him after you created a crisis. He'll recover despite your heroics, not because of them. You should remember that when you're thinking about what happened here. He turned to leave, the papers already in his hand. You're discharged tomorrow. Try to stay out of trouble. The next afternoon, Margaret signed the discharge papers against medical advice. The form required a signature from someone in authority, and she signed it herself since no one else was coming, and drove away from Seattle General in a 2012 Subaru that smelled like stale coffee and miles. Her arm in a sling. Her side wrapped so tight it felt like breathing through a coffee filter. Painkillers making the edges of the world soft in a way that made her want to scream. She drove to Greenwood Cemetery in Raleigh because that's where Tom was buried, and because sometimes when you have nowhere else to go, you go to the person who understood why you couldn't stay put. The rain started before she got there, the kind of November rain that comes sideways, that soaks through everything. She stood at his grave in that rain for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, her voice so quiet the words barely made it out of her throat. I couldn't stay hidden like you asked. Her voice cracked. I broke cover for James's captain and now they've taken everything. I failed you. I failed the mission. I failed to just be nobody. The words dissolved in the rain and pain. Her knees buckled, and she sat down in the mud beside his headstone, rain plastering her grey hair to her face, her shoulders shaking with something that looked like crying but felt like drowning. The immobilized shoulder screamed. Her ribs sent out fresh warnings. Everything hurt in a way that meant she was still alive, and she wasn't sure anymore if that was a mercy or a punishment. She would have stayed there until the cold took her, probably, if the groundskeeper hadn't found her at dusk, his face creased with the specific kind of worry that comes from finding a woman in a hospital gown under a cemetery tree. He called someone. That someone was James. But that wasn't the real nightmare. Not yet. The nightmare was what Seattle General discovered when they ran her background check for the termination file, standard procedure, routine administrative task, a form being processed by a secretary who didn't know what flag she'd triggered. The system flagged something that shouldn't exist in the civilian medical system at all, a classified security clearance, current and active, stamped with a service number that traced back to the Navy Medical Corps. Major Margaret Walsh. Status, deceased in theater, 2019. Operation, classified. Theater, Bagram Airfield, 2019. Disposition, buried per agency directive. Margaret Walsh was supposed to be dead. James arrived at her apartment in Raleigh 36 hours later, still in his flight suit from the military transport that had brought him stateside early, still moving with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd just spent 12 hours accelerating through the world because someone told him his mother was dying. He wasn't yelling when he came through the door, but he wanted to be. She could see it in the way his jaw was clenched, the way his hands made fists and then opened again, looking for something to hold onto. Mom, they're saying you're a major. His voice was breaking. What the hell is happening? Margaret was still trying to form words. her throat was dry, the hospital hadn't let her leave with any real pain management, and everything hurt in layers, when her apartment door opened again. Captain Derek Moss walked in on crutches, his chest bandaged, his face pale but his eyes sharp. Behind him came 5 Navy SEALs in tactical casual dress, jeans and hoodies, and the particular kind of calm that only comes from people trained to move through violence without flinching. The man in front was older, with a lieutenant commander's insignia, carrying a red folder stamped across the front with a word that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. "Classified." "Major Margaret Walsh," he said. Margaret closed her eyes. "2 silver stars," Garrett continued, his voice steady as a metronome. "The first from the operation in Bagram, where you held a field hospital alone for 16 hours under sustained enemy fire. 47 casualties. No supplies. No backup." One of the SEALs made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob. He was young, maybe 30, with a prosthetic leg that he wore like it was just another piece of gear. "She saved my life that night. I was number 33. I was bleeding out, thought I was done, and she put pressure on it and said, 'Not today, petty officer. Not on my watch.'" Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him. She didn't remember his face, but she remembered that voice, high and panicked, young. She remembered the pressure she'd applied, the calculation of how much blood he'd lost, the decision that he was worth fighting for. "The second silver star," Garrett said, "for extracting Senator Bradley's daughter from Kandahar when her security detail was killed. You carried her 4 miles through hostile territory with a compound fracture in your leg." Captain Moss spoke for the first time, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd had him on. "She was declared KIA when the CIA buried the mission." Another SEAL stepped forward, older, with scars on his neck that looked like they'd come from something that didn't want to let go. "We've been looking for you for 5 years, Major. You were our combat medic instructor at Coronado before Bagram. You taught half this unit how to stay alive." "Navy Cross citation," Garrett said, opening the red folder. "For saving 12 lives during a clinic bombing in Helmand Province. You performed field amputations under collapsed rubble for 7 hours. The room was so quiet Margaret could hear the rain against the windows, could hear James's breathing, could hear her own heartbeat in her ears like it was trying to convince her to keep going. She looked at her son, and one tear escaped before she could stop it. "They told me if I ever surfaced, if anyone ever connected me to those operations, it would compromise assets still in theater," she said quietly. "So I became nobody." Then the door opened again. Dr. Richard Ashford was standing there in his hospital credentials, his face the color of old plaster, and behind him stood an FBI special agent with a badge that caught the apartment's light and threw it back like a warning. "Dr. Richard Ashford," the agent said, "you're under arrest for falsifying federal medical records and attempting to alter a decorated officer's classified file. We've been investigating your medication diversion ring for 8 months. The man who opened fire in your ICU? His brother died from chemotherapy drugs you sold diluted for profit. Major Walsh saw your medication logs. You've been trying to bury her ever since." The handcuffs made a clicking sound that wasn't quite as satisfying as Margaret thought it would be. The handcuffs made a clicking sound that wasn't quite as satisfying as Margaret thought it would be. She was 3 days post-op on her second surgery when the background check flagged something that shouldn't exist. A civilian nurse with a top-secret SCI security clearance dating back to 2009. A clearance that had been renewed every 5 years like clockwork, maintained by an agency that technically didn't acknowledge she'd worked there. The hospital's HR director, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd been avoiding eye contact since Margaret's shooting, had to call the Department of Defense to understand what she was looking at. She handed Margaret a printed email, her hands trembling slightly. Margaret read it once and understood the chain reaction that was about to begin. James arrived at her apartment 4 days after discharge, still in his flight suit from the transport plane, still smelling like jet fuel and the kind of exhaustion that comes from flying 8 hours straight on bad news. He found her in the kitchen, barely moving, her left arm still immobilized, pain meds wearing off because she'd stopped taking them at scheduled intervals, and he held out a letter with the Department of Defense seal like it might explode. "Mom, they're saying you're a major," he said, his voice cracking like it hadn't since he was 16. "What the hell is happening?" Margaret took the letter with her right hand. Her son was staring at her like she was a stranger wearing her face. The tremor she felt wasn't pain, it was the ground shifting under 23 years of careful construction. "Sit down," she said quietly. She was still holding the letter when Captain Moss walked through her door on crutches, his leg wrapped in compression bandages, the left side of his dress uniform still creased from the transport, and behind him came the SEAL unit. Not all of them, 14 operators, moving through her living room like water finding its level, their presence so concentrated it made the air pressure change. Their lieutenant commander was a man named Graves, call-signed Iron, and he carried a red folder that looked sealed by institutional weight itself. James stood up. Margaret stayed where she was. "Major Walsh," Graves said, and the formality of it cracked something in her chest she'd locked away since Kandahar. "We need to read you something." He opened the folder with the deliberate care of someone performing a ceremony. The citation inside had been sitting in a classified file for 14 years, waiting for the moment when keeping it secret became impossible. "Major Margaret Walsh, decorated with 2 silver stars," Graves read, his voice steady as a metronome. "First Silver Star, Operation Endeavour, Bagram Airfield, 2009, for maintaining continuous medical operations at Forward Operating Base Shank for 16 hours under sustained indirect fire while 8 surgical personnel were evacuated due to casualties, personally treating 47 patients with a resupply rate of 0, preventing 14 deaths through field triage and improvised surgical techniques under mortar fire." The silence in the apartment was so thick you could operate in it. James's face had gone the color of old bone. Graves turned the page. "Second Silver Star, Operation Nightingale, Kandahar Province, 2010, for tactical extraction of civilian assets under fire, coordinating evacuation of 12 individuals including 1 federal asset through active combat zone, personally suppressing return fire while establishing medical stabilization for 3 critically wounded personnel." Margaret felt James's eyes on her like hands. She didn't look back at him. "And finally," Graves said, and his voice dropped to register, Navy Cross. Citation reads, "Major Margaret Walsh performed life-saving medical intervention under direct enemy fire during attack on civilian medical clinic in Kandahar, June 15, 2010. Despite being wounded twice, Major Walsh stabilized 12 critically injured civilians and extracted them from the engagement area using suppressive fire and field medical protocol under conditions of active combat. Her actions resulted in 12 survivors where 0 were anticipated." The words hung in the air like smoke. Captain Moss, standing beside Graves on his crutches, was looking at her the way a man looks at someone who held his life in her hands and didn't put it down. James's mouth had opened without sound coming out. Then the apartment door opened again. Dr. Richard Ashford stepped inside with 2 administrators, both of them looking like they'd swallowed broken glass. Ashford's designer scrubs had been replaced with hospital-issued clothes, and his face had gone the specific shade of white that comes from understanding you've been wrong about every calculation you ever made. Behind him, barely visible in the hallway, stood an FBI agent with the kind of patient expression that meant she'd done this before and would do it again. "Dr. Ashford," the agent said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional machinery, "Richard Matthew Ashford, you're under arrest for falsification of federal medical records, attempting to alter a classified officer's security documentation, and conspiracy to distribute controlled pharmaceutical substances through interstate commerce channels. We've been investigating your medication diversion ring for 8 months. You're looking at a minimum of 20 years. The click of the handcuffs was the same sound as before, but different now. Ashford didn't resist, he simply allowed his wrists to be secured, moving like a puppet operated by someone who'd just lost interest in the performance. His eyes tried to find Margaret, but she was looking through him like he was glass. They walked him out past the recovery room where Margaret had spent 3 days, past the unit board where her write-up still hung in red marker, past every nurse he'd ever silenced with a look or a word that carried the weight of hiring and firing and reputation. The FBI agents moved with the kind of professionalism that made it clear they'd inventoried his office, seized his computers, found the offshore accounts, located the pharmacy contacts, and calculated exactly how many patients had died because morphine was replaced with saline and hope. Agent Torres had brought Margaret the file in her hospital room before the arrest, sat beside her bed in a chair that squeaked like wounded animals, and explained the mechanics of his panic. How he'd seen her looking at Captain Moss's medication logs, noticed her flagging the dosages that didn't match the pain responses. How he'd recognized the same pattern she'd found in 2 other patients before he moved her to nights in orthopedics. How every humiliation, every reassignment, every public criticism was about isolation. If she reported the discrepancies, nobody would listen to someone he'd already discredited. When she saved Captain Moss with that field thoracotomy, performed with a combat knife and the kind of steady hands that come from having done it in tents under indirect fire, she became the hero of the ICU overnight. His worst nightmare. So he'd blamed her for the shooting, tried to bury her, attempted to erase the one person who could prove he was diluting chemotherapy drugs and selling the excess to overseas buyers while patients received saline and false hope. 14 patients harmed. 3 dead. $1.3 million moved through accounts in 7 countries over 3 years. His bail was denied when prosecutors argued flight risk, and the last footage showed him in county jail scrubs, his hands shaking as he was led to a holding cell. His medical license was revoked in Washington, then Oregon, then California, then 9 more states as the investigation expanded, and each state board added another nail into the coffin of Richard Ashford's career. 6 months later, Margaret stood in Seattle General's new Veterans Trauma Wing in her dress blues, her uniform crisp as an order, watching the dedication ceremony from behind the glass that separated the teaching station from the ICU. Her shoulder still ached on cold days, a dull persistent reminder that some decisions cost blood. Captain Moss was there in full dress uniform, his chest full of ribbons that represented 23 years of decisions made in the dark, and when he approached her at the ceremony, he moved like a man approaching something sacred. "James told me you kept his dog tag all these years," Moss said quietly, and she felt the weight of what that meant shift in her chest. "I kept mine because he saved my life in Helmand. I didn't know I'd need you to save it again." She kept both dog tags in her pocket now, her son's and the captain's, both chains repaired by a jeweler in Raleigh who didn't ask questions, both links restored to whole. The SEAL unit stood at attention as the hospital administrator read her citation aloud, 23 operators in dress blues holding perfect posture while the world finally learned what Major Margaret Walsh had done in the dark places where most people never go. When she finally let herself cry, it was in front of people who understood that some wounds earn you the right to stand publicly for what matters. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence for the 14 patients lost to Ashford's crimes, and Margaret placed flowers at the memorial wall herself, her right hand steady while her left remained at her side. Afterward, driving past a strip mall on Highway 40, she saw him. Dr. Richard Ashford at a folding table in a parking lot under a banner reading discount insurance, low rates, his dress shirt wrinkled, his eyes hollow as cars passed without stopping. She didn't slow down. That life was already finished. That night, James asked what she'd tell her students on the first day of the combat medicine program, and she ran her thumb over the dog tags in her pocket, the weight of them familiar now, both chains complete. "Power is not a title," she said simply. "Power is the ability to help." Outside, rain fell on Raleigh in steady sheets, and for the first time in 5 years, Major Margaret Walsh slept without checking the locks or listening for footsteps in the hallway. The nightmares didn't come. The past, finally, had learned to stay buried. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven them dead wrong, subscribe, like, and comment below. Tell us, have you ever discovered the truth was bigger than you imagined?